I work for a secret government department that deals with unknown crises. That's not the sort of thing you can put on a resume, and it's definitely not something I ever imagined myself saying. But here I am, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror of my apartment, wondering if the face looking back at me is even real anymore. Let me start from the beginning. My name is David Parker, and until 3 months ago, I was living what you'd call a perfectly ordinary life. I worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized insurance company, spent my weekends catching up on streaming shows, and occasionally met friends for drinks at the local pub. Nothing exceptional, nothing strange, just normal. That all changed on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in October. I remember it clearly because the weather had been unusually severe, with sheets of water cascading down my apartment windows and thunder that made the building itself seem to shudder. I had just settled in with a microwave dinner when I heard something slide under my door. At first, I thought it was just another takeout menu or real estate flyer, but when I walked over to check, I found a single black envelope. Not dark blue, not charcoal gray, but the kind of black that seems to swallow light. There was no postmark, no return address, not even my name, just that envelope, slightly warm to the touch despite the cold draft from the hallway. Inside was a single business card, made of what felt like metal rather than paper. It was the same impossible black as the envelope, with only a phone number embossed in silver lettering that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. I spent 3 days debating whether to call. Something about that card felt wrong, like it was somehow more real than everything else in my apartment. I caught myself staring at it for hours, watching the way it never quite seemed to gather dust or change temperature. When I finally worked up the courage to dial the number, I almost hung up after the first ring. The voice that answered wasn't what I expected. It was a woman's voice, but unnaturally deep, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. She didn't greet me or ask who was calling. Instead, she simply said, "Tomorrow, 3 p.m., the Meridian Mall. Enter through the service entrance behind the old food court. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty." I tried to ask questions, but the line went dead. The Meridian Mall had been abandoned for years, a massive structure on the outskirts of town that had slowly decayed after the anchor stores pulled out. I knew I should have ignored the whole thing, should have thrown away the card and gone back to my safe, predictable life. But that card had awakened something in me, a curiosity that bordered on obsession. The next day, I found myself standing in the mall's empty parking lot, surrounded by cracked concrete where weeds pushed through like desperate fingers reaching for the sky. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down with unusual force. As I walked around to the service entrance, I noticed something strange about my footsteps. They didn't echo the way they should have in such an empty space. Instead, the sound seemed to get swallowed up by the air itself. The service entrance was exactly where the voice had said it would be, but it wasn't the rusted, graffiti-covered door I expected. Instead, I found myself staring at what appeared to be a brand new security door, its brushed steel surface unmarked by time or vandals. Next to it was a small black panel that matched the color of the business card perfectly. I noticed something odd about the door's shadow. It fell in the wrong direction, stretching away from the sunlight rather than toward it. As I watched, the shadow seemed to ripple, like dark water disturbed by unseen movement. A cold breeze whispered past me, carrying what sounded like distant whispers in languages I'd never heard before. The parking lot behind me had gone silent, not just quiet, but completely devoid of sound. Even the ambient noise of the city had disappeared, replaced by a pressing silence that felt almost alive. When I turned to look back, the lot seemed larger than before, the cracked concrete stretching out impossibly far into a horizon that shouldn't have been visible from this angle. My watch had stopped working, but not in any normal way. The hands were moving, but they weren't tracking time. They were tracing patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. The numbers on the face had changed too, replaced by symbols that seemed to shift and change whenever I tried to focus on them. As I approached, the door swung open silently, revealing a well-lit corridor that shouldn't have existed. The walls were pristine white, the floor polished to a mirror finish. The air that drifted out was cool and clean, carrying a faint scent of ozone. A man in a perfectly tailored black suit stood waiting, his face pleasant but forgettable in a way that made it hard to focus on his features. "Mr. Parker," he said, showing no surprise at my arrival. "Thank you for being punctual. Please follow me." The corridor seemed to stretch much further than the mall's actual dimensions should have allowed. We passed door after door, each identical and unmarked, until finally stopping at what appeared to be a blank section of wall. The man in the suit placed his hand against it, and the wall simply ceased to exist, revealing a large room that defied explanation. The interview room, if that's what it was, appeared to be composed entirely of mirrors, but they didn't reflect normally. Each surface showed something slightly different, as if looking into parallel versions of the same space. In one reflection, the room appeared to be underwater. In another, it seemed to extend infinitely, and in some, I could swear I saw movements that didn't correspond to anything in the room with us. My interviewer sat down at a desk that seemed to fade in and out of existence depending on how directly I looked at it. "Please take a seat," she said, and I realized with a start that the man who had led me here was gone, replaced by a woman whose face remained perpetually in shadow, despite the bright lighting. I hadn't seen them switch places. I hadn't seen anyone move at all. The transition had occurred in the space between moments, in the blind spot between thoughts. The chair I sat in felt wrong, not uncomfortable exactly, but as if it had been designed by someone who had only seen humans in photographs. The angles were slightly off, the proportions just different enough to create a constant sense of unease. As I shifted my weight, I could feel the surface of the chair responding, adjusting itself in ways that furniture shouldn't be able to move. "Let's begin," the interviewer said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the mirrors vibrate sympathetically. "Tell me, Mr. Parker, what do you see when you close your eyes and try to look at the thoughts behind your thoughts?" The question made no sense, and yet I found myself answering. "Colors that don't exist," I heard myself say. "Shapes that fold in on themselves. Sometimes I see spaces between my memories. Gaps that seem to lead somewhere else." She nodded, though the movement didn't quite match the shadow where her head should be. "And how many times do you think you've actually woken up today?" I paused, suddenly uncertain. I had memories of waking up in my apartment, getting dressed, eating breakfast, but I also remembered waking up in places that couldn't exist. A room where gravity pulled sideways, a bed made of living shadows, a morning that lasted for 3 days. I'm not sure anymore. "Good," she said, the word creating ripples in the air that distorted the reflections around us. "Uncertainty is the correct response. Reality is far more fluid than most people suspect." The living ink on her desk formed into a series of images. My apartment building seen from impossible angles. My daily commute stretched across multiple timelines. Versions of myself that had made different choices at crucial moments. "We've been watching you, Mr. Parker. You see things others don't. You notice the places where reality doesn't quite line up properly." She was right. I had always noticed odd things. Moments where time seemed to skip, places where space folded wrongly, people who seemed to exist slightly out of sync with the world around them. I had trained myself to ignore these observations, to focus on what everyone else considered normal. But now, in this impossible room, those experiences suddenly felt like qualifications. "The department requires individuals who can perceive the true nature of reality without letting it drive them mad," she continued. "Most people, when confronted with what lies beneath the surface of their comfortable world, simply break. Their minds can't handle the contradiction between what they've been taught is possible and what actually exists." The shadows around her face shifted, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of what might have been her true appearance. Something that existed in more dimensions than human flesh was meant to occupy. We operate in the spaces between what people think is real and what actually is. We handle the crises that would shatter society's comfortable illusions about the nature of existence. She reached into the air beside her desk and pulled out a contract that seemed to be written in constantly shifting text. "The salary, as you can see, is substantial. The numbers on the page changed every time I tried to focus on them, but they all seemed to indicate wealth beyond anything I had imagined possible. But more importantly, we offer you the chance to see behind the curtain, to understand the true nature of reality itself. The shadows in the room deepened as she spoke, taking on weight and substance. In the mirrors around us, I could see reflections of events that hadn't happened yet. Myself signing the contract, walking down impossible corridors, facing things that shouldn't exist. Of course there are conditions, she continued. You'll need to distance yourself from your old life gradually. No sudden disappearances, no dramatic changes that might draw attention. Just a slow, careful fade into a different kind of existence. After what felt like both minutes and hours, she smiled. At least, I think she smiled. It was hard to tell with the shadows that clung to her face like a living mask. Mr. Parker, how would you like to work for a department that doesn't exist, dealing with crises that shouldn't be possible? The salary she mentioned was astronomical, enough to set me up for life several times over, but it came with conditions. I would have to disappear from my old life gradually, making it seem natural. No sudden departures, no dramatic changes, just a slow fade into a different kind of existence. And I would have to sign a confidentiality agreement that made my insurance company's NDAs look like children's pinky promises. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded more answers. Instead, I found myself signing papers that seemed to shift their text when I tried to read them closely. With each signature, I felt something fundamental changing, as if reality itself was being rewritten around me. Welcome to the department, she said, standing and extending her hand. When I shook it, her skin felt like silk stretched over glass. Report to the extraction point tomorrow morning. And Mr. Parker, don't bother bringing anything from your old life. Where you're going, none of it will make sense anymore. As I left the mall that evening, I noticed that the sun seemed to set in the wrong direction, and the stars that began to appear in the darkening sky formed constellations I'd never seen before. I had the unsettling feeling that I had just signed away something far more valuable than my time or silence. I just didn't know what it was yet. The next morning arrived with an odd sense of detachment, as if I was watching someone else's life through a foggy window. The extraction point turned out to be an abandoned bus stop that nobody else seemed able to see. I stood there for exactly 17 minutes before a black vehicle pulled up. I say vehicle because while it looked like a standard government SUV, something about its proportions felt wrong, as if it had been designed by someone who had only ever had cars described to them but never actually seen one. The driver didn't speak as I got in, and I quickly realized why. There was no driver at all, just an empty seat that somehow operated the vehicle with perfect precision. The windows darkened automatically, and I felt the SUV begin to move. Without any visual references, I lost all sense of direction and speed. We could have been traveling for 20 minutes or 5 hours when we finally stopped. When the door opened, I found myself in what appeared to be an underground parking facility, but the ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into darkness. A woman stood waiting for me, clipboard in hand. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Isabella Romano, but something about her eyes made me uncomfortable. They never moved, not even to blink. "Welcome to the Department of Unknown Crises," she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "Please stay close to me during the orientation. The facility doesn't always appreciate newcomers, and we wouldn't want you ending up in last Thursday or the wrong dimension." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The elevator we stepped into was made entirely of glass, including the floor, but instead of seeing the shaft below, I saw what appeared to be entire cities, landscapes, and in one horrifying moment, something that looked like Earth but wasn't quite right. The sun was green there, and the continents were all wrong. 30 floors down, Dr. Romano announced as we descended. Though floors is really more of a comforting approximation. Space gets a bit flexible once you pass the first 15 levels. She wasn't exaggerating. As we went deeper, I noticed the walls of the facility seemed to breathe. Not in a metaphorical sense, but actually expanding and contracting like living tissue. The corridors curved in ways that violated basic geometry, and doors led to places that couldn't possibly exist within the building's dimensions. "Your office is down here," she said, leading me down a hallway that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, though it might move around a bit until it gets used to you. They do that sometimes. We passed several other employees during our walk. Some looked normal enough, but others. There was a man whose shadow fell in the wrong direction, a woman who appeared to be walking on the ceiling as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and someone who existed only as a ripple in the air, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. My office turned out to be a room that defied description. The walls were covered in monitors showing places and events I couldn't comprehend. Some displayed what looked like live footage of historical events, others showed places that couldn't exist, and one screen seemed to be showing my own back as I watched the monitors. "You'll be working with a specialized team," Dr. Romano continued, seemingly unperturbed by any of this. "Let me introduce you to them." First was Director Hopkins, a tall man who wore sunglasses indoors. I later learned this wasn't an affectation. He had to wear them because his eyes saw too much of reality at once. Behind the dark lenses, I sometimes caught glimpses of swirling colors that didn't exist in any normal spectrum. James Cooper was our field agent, a man whose tribal tattoos weren't actually tattoos at all, but living patterns that shifted and moved across his skin. They were beautiful and terrifying to watch, especially when they seemed to reach out toward nearby objects. Finally, there was Lisa Blackwood, our technology specialist. She spoke in multiple voices simultaneously, each one saying slightly different things, as if multiple versions of her were trying to exist in the same space at the same time. Her computers ran on something that definitely wasn't electricity, and the screens displayed information in ways that hurt my brain to look at directly. "Your training begins immediately," Dr. Romano announced. "We're currently tracking 17 different crises across 12 dimensions in what might be an alternate timeline. We need you operational as soon as possible." She handed me a device that looked like a smartphone but felt wrong in my hand, as if it was made of materials that shouldn't exist. "This is your reality anchor," she explained. "Keep it with you at all times. It helps prevent memory alteration and temporal displacement. Without it, you might find yourself remembering futures that haven't happened yet, or forgetting pasts that have." The rest of that first day was a blur of impossible information and realities that shouldn't exist. I learned about previous incidents the department had handled. A town that had disappeared, not just from the map, but from history itself, leaving behind only a handful of people who remembered it ever existed. There were the mirror people of Lake Michigan, entities that lived on the other side of reflective surfaces, and sometimes tried to trade places with their human counterparts. But the most disturbing case they showed me involved something they called the darkness that ate sound. It had started in a small coastal village where people began noticing pockets of absolute silence. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound that swallowed everything, even screams. The darkness spread for weeks, consuming all noise in its path, until the department finally contained it. They kept it in a special chamber deep within the facility. I could see it through the observation window, a patch of darkness that seemed to fold in on itself, creating shapes that made my eyes hurt. During my first week, I noticed things that didn't add up. Small things at first, like how some of my fellow trainees would vanish without anyone remembering they existed. I'd walk into the break room and find myself in mid-conversation with someone, only to return later and discover that not only was that person gone, but their name had disappeared from all records, and no one else could remember them. The security footage was even stranger. The monitors in my office sometimes showed events that hadn't happened yet. I'd watch myself walking down corridors I hadn't visited, having conversations I hadn't experienced. Once, I saw footage of myself running in terror from something just off camera, my face contorted in horror. That particular event hadn't happened yet, but the timestamp on the video was only 3 days away. Then there were the notes. I'd find them on my desk, written in my own handwriting but in languages I didn't know. Some weren't written in any known language at all, the symbols shifting and changing as I tried to read them. When I showed them to Lisa Blackwood, all 3 of her voices went silent at once, something I'd never seen happen before. "You're adapting faster than most," Director Hopkins told me one day, his sunglasses reflecting impossible colors. "Most new recruits take months to start perceiving temporal anomalies. You're already seeing through the veil." I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Everything changed on a rainy Monday in Oregon. The department received reports of unusual phenomena in a small town called Milbrook. People were aging backwards, their memories remaining intact while their bodies regressed to younger versions of themselves. But that wasn't the worst part. Local wildlife had begun evolving at an accelerated rate, producing creatures that defied biological classification. Birds with tentacles instead of wings, deer with crystalline antlers that broadcasted strange frequencies, insects that could phase through solid matter. Our team was dispatched immediately. The ride there wasn't in any normal vehicle. We stepped through what looked like a painting of our destination and simply emerged on the other side. The town looked normal at first glance, but that illusion quickly shattered. The sky above Milbrook rippled with colors that human eyes shouldn't be able to process. Several buildings appeared to be breathing, their walls expanding and contracting like lungs. And the people. Some of them were young children with the eyes and voices of the elderly, while others had aged into ancient beings, still wearing children's clothes. The temporal distortion is centered around the construction site, James Cooper announced, his tattoos writhing agitatedly across his skin. They were digging the foundation for a new shopping center when they found something. That something turned out to be a sphere about the size of a basketball, completely black but somehow radiating light. It pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, each beat sending waves of distortion through the air around it. Local residents had gathered around the excavation site, speaking in tongues that made the air itself vibrate. Their prophecies of doom echoed with harmonics that caused nearby windows to shatter. Dr. Romano's eyes remained fixed on the sphere, still unblinking. "The artifact is older than time," she said, her voice carrying that strange multitonal quality. "It shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be anywhere." As we approached the sphere, reality began to break down around us. Time moved differently depending on where you stood. I watched Lisa age 5 years and regress to childhood in the space of a few steps. The ground beneath our feet kept shifting between different geological eras, transforming from modern concrete to prehistoric swamp, to futuristic alloy and back again. The team tried to establish a containment perimeter, but conventional methods proved useless. Our reality anchors started malfunctioning, their screens displaying countdown timers that went backward and forward. Simultaneously, Director Hopkins removed his sunglasses for the first time since I'd met him, revealing eyes that spiraled into infinity, each pupil containing galaxies of impossible colors. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Local residents began experiencing vivid hallucinations, but we quickly realized they weren't hallucinations at all. They were seeing through the walls of reality itself. People reported glimpses of beings that existed between moments of time, creatures that defied description lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Some claimed they could see their own deaths, their futures splintering into countless possibilities. During the chaos, I found myself separated from the team. My reality anchor was malfunctioning, its screen showing what looked like an infinite series of error messages in languages that burned themselves into my retinas. I stumbled into what had once been a local library, though now the books on its shelves contained stories that hadn't been written yet, and histories that never happened. That's where I found the first clue that something was deeply wrong with the department itself. Hidden behind a shelf that seemed to exist in multiple places at once, I discovered a cache of old files. They weren't supposed to be there. Nothing from our department was ever supposed to leave the facility. But there they were, yellowed pages filled with reports that made my blood run cold. The files revealed a truth so horrifying that at first, I thought I was misunderstanding them. The department hadn't been created to protect humanity from these crises, they had been deliberately engineering them. Each incident, each breach in reality, was a carefully orchestrated experiment. The disappearing town, the mirror people, the darkness that ate sound, all of them were tests designed to study how reality itself responded to systematic stress. I learned that Director Hopkins had died 15 years ago in what the files called a temporal displacement incident. The version of him walking around the facility was something else, a consciousness stretched across multiple timelines, existing everywhere and nowhere at once. The department itself operated in a similar way, maintaining offices in different dimensions and timelines simultaneously. As I read through the files, I began to notice something strange about my memories. I could suddenly recall multiple versions of my interview, each slightly different. In some, I had rejected the job offer and walked away. In others, I had never received the black envelope at all. Yet here I was, standing in a library where time flowed like water, holding proof that everything I thought I knew was a lie. A noise behind me made me turn. Dr. Romano stood in the doorway, but something was different about her. Her unblinking eyes had taken on a metallic sheen, and her lab coat seemed to be made of living shadow. "You weren't supposed to find those," she said, all three of her voices speaking in perfect unison. "Not yet anyway, though I suppose it was inevitable. You've been showing signs of accelerated awareness since day one." "What are we really doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is the department's true purpose?" Her smile was like watching ice crack. "We're preparing humanity, David. Reality is far more fragile than anyone suspects, and it's beginning to break down. These crises we handle, they're not accidents, they're stress tests, measuring points where we push against the boundaries of what's possible. We need to understand how reality behaves when it fails, because something is coming, something that exists in the spaces between possibilities." Before I could respond, the ground beneath our feet began to vibrate, not like an earthquake, more like reality itself was shuddering. Through the library's windows, I could see the sphere they'd unearthed at the construction site beginning to pulse with increasing intensity. Each beat sent waves of distortion through the air, and with each wave, more of the town's true nature was revealed. Buildings flickered between different architectural styles as time periods overlapped. People walking down the street left trails of themselves behind, each moment of their existence stretching out like frames in a film. The sky had become a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, and through gaps in the clouds, I caught glimpses of what looked like enormous eyes watching from above. Dr. Romano's expression changed as she looked at the sky, her face taking on an almost rapturous quality. "They're coming through," she whispered, her three voices fragmenting into a chorus of overlapping tones. "The barriers are finally thinning enough for them to reach us." "Who's coming through?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew I didn't want the answer. "The ones who've been watching us all along," she replied. "The ones who taught me how to exist across multiple timelines. Did you really think I was human? I haven't been human for centuries." As if to demonstrate her point, her form began to shift. The lab coat she wore melted into her skin, which rippled like liquid metal. Her unblinking eyes multiplied, spreading across her face in impossible patterns. When she moved, she left traces of herself behind, like after images burned into reality. "The department was never meant to stop these incursions," she continued, her voice now coming from everywhere at once. "We were creating weak points, places where the barriers between realities could be systematically broken down. Every crisis we've handled has been another crack in the wall of existence." The sphere at the construction site suddenly pulsed with blinding intensity. The wave of energy that rolled out from it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like reality itself was being rewritten. When my vision cleared, I saw that the town had transformed. Buildings stretched upward at impossible angles, their architecture defying gravity and sanity alike. Streets twisted into Mobius strips, cars driving endlessly along their surfaces without ever reaching their destinations. And in the sky, something was emerging through the kaleidoscope of colors. It was vast beyond comprehension, a being that existed between moments of time. Its form seemed to be composed of pure thought and negative space, areas where reality simply ceased to exist. Looking at it directly was impossible. My mind could only process fragments of its true nature, like trying to understand an ocean by looking at single drops of water. James Cooper appeared beside me, his tribal tattoos now moving so frantically they were practically leaping off his skin. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. "The whole timeline is becoming unstable. If we stay here much longer, we'll be caught in the collapse." but Dr. Romano blocked our path. "Nobody's leaving," she said, her multiple voices creating harmonics that made my teeth vibrate. "You're all going to witness the beginning of a new reality. The entity above us has existed since before time itself. It's been watching humanity through every crisis, every breakdown in reality, and now it's ready to remake everything." Lisa Blackwood's voices screamed in warning, but it was too late. Dr. Romano raised her hands and reality began to tear apart around us. The walls of the library peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing the raw chaos that lurked beneath the surface of existence. Through the gaps, I could see other versions of myself, countless alternatives living out different choices and possibilities. The entity above the town was growing larger, or perhaps reality itself was shrinking in its presence. Its influence spread like a stain across creation, transforming everything it touched. People caught in its shadow began to change, their bodies and minds reshaping themselves to match its impossible geometry. Some simply ceased to exist, while others multiplied, splitting into dozens of parallel versions of themselves. Director Hopkins appeared suddenly, his sunglasses gone, his spiral eyes blazing with otherworldly light. "You've doomed us all, Isabella," he said, his voice echoing with the weight of multiple timelines. "The department was supposed to study these phenomena, not unleash them. We were supposed to prepare humanity, not sacrifice it.